When people look back on this time and look back on this conflict, I honestly believe they will see this as one of the defining moments of our century. And you did it.
No victory parade this, and clearly some were pleased to see him. But are Tony Blair's bold claims about the war undermined by the lack of evidence to justify it? Good evening. 3 years into the 21st century, it might be a bit soon to judge its legacy, but that didn't stop Tony Blair making some pretty immense claims today. But his visit is shrouded in questions over the evidence used to justify the war. The government admitted today using one uncorroborated source for that key claim about Iraq having a weapon it could use in 45 minutes. But it denied sexing up the evidence against the advice of British intelligence. Also tonight, the Potters Bar rail crash inquiry. It wasn't sabotage, it was bad maintenance, but still nobody accepts responsibility. After 7 days without food and water, Abbas Amini is continuing his hunger strike despite winning his asylum case. Now he's doing it for the others. The British peace protester shot in the head by Israeli soldiers returns home in a coma. His father and an Israeli spokesman join us live. And as the latest health scare emerges, this time about chlorine in swimming pools being linked to asthma, when is science bogus?
And the other headlines tonight, the bloody civil war in the Democratic Republic of Congo is in the spotlight again. In the wake of a series of brutal attacks on civilians, Britain is now likely to join a UN mission led by French peacekeepers. The jury in the trial of Tripti Patel, the woman accused of killing her 3 babies, has heard evidence from a scientist suggesting their deaths may be the result of a genetic disorder. And the Department of Health says the antidepressant drug Seroxat may be linked to 8 suicides and adverse effects in more than 1,000 cases.
Well, as well as calling the war in Iraq a defining moment, the Prime Minister told British troops in southern Iraq that although there were still questions at home over the war, their performance had been magnificent. The day was very much about good news, with Mr. Blair also spending time at a school in the region and visiting a British warship. So when asked by journalists about claims that the government had doctored information about Iraq's weapons of mass destruction to help sell the war against Iraq to the British public, the Prime Minister ignored the question, simply insisting he had absolutely no doubt about the existence of such weapons. Our political correspondent Gary Gibbon reports.
It was the war leader's dream photo opportunity. Tony Blair mobbed by grateful liberated children in the playground of a Basra school. One boy, urged on by his teachers, delivered the crowning image. Tony Blair looked visibly moved by the reception here. Inevitably, this trip was painstakingly designed to accentuate the positive. Though lawlessness has kept many other schools closed and many other buildings and utilities are in tatters, Mr. Blair came to a school which British soldiers had helped to get up and running again.
And we from my country and the people here are delighted to have helped you in this regard.
Earlier, Mr. Blair addressed 400 British soldiers gathered at their temporary base in one of Saddam Hussein's old presidential palaces.
This is for me, I should think, is it? Right. I just start away, do I?
Please, sir.
Okay.
Yep, they're at your
Well, it's really good of you to have me here today. And I'd just like to express the sense of pride that everybody has in Britain over the magnificent job you've done.
Mr. Blair said he hoped that in a couple of years Iraq would be a peaceful, functioning democracy that some soldiers might like to revisit. And he claimed that the war in Iraq had transformed attitudes in the world's most unstable and threatening region.
And the other thing I think will be very clear is that when people look back on this time and look back on this conflict, I honestly believe they will see this as one of the defining moments of our century. And you did it. It was your courage and your professionalism that did it. And I just wanted to say to you, because I know people back home, you know, you'll read lots in the media and the newspapers. I just want to say this to you. People back home are incredibly proud of what you've done.
But back home, controversy was still raging about the government's original reasons for going to war.
Pictures are the bit of the job for the season, so anyone who wants a picture can...
Even as the glad-handing carried on in Basra, there were fresh claims that the government had stretched the truth in the build-up to war, when it claimed that Saddam's regime was capable of mobilizing weapons of mass destruction in 45 minutes flat. The government denied that MI6 had warned it not to publish that claim, but admitted it was based on only one source.
In terms of that particular aspect of it, as best I understand that, and that remains the case. But that of itself, if it was single source, doesn't make it inaccurate any more than corroborated sourcing proves something. What we've got to do is have best judgment on the breadth of the information available to us and the depth of that information, and then make those political judgments.
Well, I feel astonished more than anything else that we should now hear that something as important a piece of intelligence as the one that you've just described should have been the subject of manipulation. If you manipulate intelligence in that way, then you really turn it from intelligence into propaganda. I think it's a source of grave embarrassment for the government, coupled with the fact that as yet no weapons of mass destruction have been discovered in Iraq.
But in Iraq, Mr. Blair was making new, even bolder claims for the war. He said the occupation of Iraq would deter terrorists, assist the Middle East peace process, moderate the behavior of countries like Syria and Iran, and make the region and the world a safer place.
Well, I've been talking to the Foreign Office Minister Bill Rammell, and after Tony Blair had said the Iraq War would prove to be one of the defining moments of the 21st century, I asked if it was a little early on in the 21st century to judge that.
I don't think that's what the Prime Minister was doing. What he was making clear was that we faced an enormous challenge in what was happening in Iraq. I happen to believe that proliferation of weapons of mass destruction is the most serious danger and threat that we face in the 21st century, and I think the Prime Minister was rightly underlining that fact.
What weapons of mass destruction?
Well, I have absolutely no doubt that Saddam was maintaining a covert weapons of mass destruction program in the run-up to the conflict, and I have no doubt that in time we will produce the evidence.
It's a matter of faith at the moment, though, isn't it? You've got absolutely no proof, and what's more, according to reports from an intelligence source, this claim that Iraq had a weapon that could be used in 45 minutes was put in after the first draft, and the intelligence services weren't happy with it.
That is absolutely and categorically not true. And please listen to my words. I'm not evading the question. I'm not ducking the issue. Not one word within that dossier was not entirely the work of the intelligence services. And I think it's important that that point is made clear. But undoubtedly, producing the evidence, the compelling evidence, will take time. Let me give you just one example.
Well, let's just talk about this dossier first. It was one source, wasn't it? One source that came up with this claim about 45 minutes, uncorroborated.
Well, intelligence sources come in a number of shapes and forms, and ministers, based on that intelligence information, have to make judgments, and that's what we did. But let me give you one example. One of the most serious and concerning elements of Saddam's concealed weapons of mass destruction program was the anthrax, which could kill millions of people. Now, that can be concealed in a vehicle as small as a petrol tanker. An ordinary petrol tanker. In a country the size of France, that is going to take time to discover.
Yeah, but you could reveal more about your intelligence now, because Saddam Hussein's gone. You wouldn't be compromising anybody. Why don't you just show us what you had?
I mean, come on, we're talking about still a very serious security situation, and if we were in a cavalier fashion to just willy-nilly throw out security information, I think that would be an extraordinarily responsible thing to do. But I will say this to you, the whole of this interview and what's been taking place in the media for the last couple of days is built upon a prediction that the weapons of mass destruction actually don't exist. If that is the case, then please answer me this question. If the weapons genuinely didn't exist, then why didn't Saddam simply comply with Resolution 1441, which, if he didn't have the weapons, he could have done? I don't think any reasonable person thinks that is plausible.
He always said it did, and the point is that your whole war was based on the assertion and the prediction that these weapons did exist, and you've been unable to prove it, weeks and weeks after the end of this war.
Well, I don't believe that is the case. We're talking about a 20,000-piece jigsaw that has been dispersed and scattered afar by Saddam, and it will take time.
Well, you could find one piece, surely. You haven't found one.
Well, we've already found vehicles which, on the basis of expert advice, appear to be mobile laboratories for producing biological weapons. But undoubtedly, further information will come forward. But we're talking about a 20,000-piece jigsaw, and that will take time to pull together.
Well, why does Paul...
But with respect, you still haven't answered my question. If he genuinely didn't have the weapons of mass destruction, then why did he not simply comply with Resolution 1441? He surely didn't have a death
Iraq
wish.
said it was complying with Resolution 1441. You said it wasn't, which is why you went to war. The point is, Paul Wolfowitz, the US Deputy Defense Secretary, now says the whole weapons of mass destruction issue was simply built up for bureaucratic reasons because he knew that that was the one thing everybody would agree on.
No, I think you're taking his remarks out of context.
That's precisely what he said.
If you look at the statement that the White House has issued today, it makes abundantly clear that they believe those weapons of mass destruction exist and they believe that the evidence for them will be found.
Foreign Office Minister Bill Rammell. Now, more than a year after 7 passengers were killed and 76 injured in the Potters Bar rail disaster, the final progress report from the Health and Safety Executive highlights major failures in maintenance and in the system that's supposed to ensure safety on the trains. Yet neither Jarvis, the maintenance contractor, nor Network Rail, the successor to Railtrack, is accepting liability. The HSE report found the points involved in the Potters Bar rail crash were poorly maintained. There appeared to be no guidance or instructions for setting up, inspection or maintenance of the points. And contrary to Jarvis's claims, no evidence had yet been established to support speculation that sabotage or deliberate unauthorised interference with the points was the direct or root cause of the derailment. Our science correspondent Andrew Veach has been looking into the findings.
A camera on Potters Bar station recorded the disaster as the 4th coach of the train hit the platform. The Cambridge flyer was travelling at the regulation 100 miles an hour when it hit faulty points about 200 yards south of the station. The 4th coach flew through the air, hit a bridge, then slid along the platform. It all took just 6 seconds. Today's report from the health and safety investigators says the underlying cause was poor maintenance by the contractors. The contractors here are Jarvis. But it says Railtrack, as it then was, failed to provide detailed guidance on how to set up, inspect and maintain the points. Major systematic failures which must be remedied, says the HSE.
The most likely cause was poor condition of these points as a result of inappropriate maintenance and adjusting. And what we've then gone on to look at is saying, well, what greater lessons can be learned? And what we're saying, it's probably due to failures in the management systems.
The maintenance contractors, Jarvis and their chairman, Paris Moedi, have suggested that sabotage was to blame, but they've refused requests for interviews, and they've not accepted liability. A spokesman said today,
Jarvis maintained the points in accordance with long-established industry procedures. Indeed, the report gives no evidence of a failure to maintain the points within the required maintenance regime. The maintenance of the points was carried out by trained and competent personnel. It is still uncertain as to what happened to cause the points to fail so catastrophically.
The rail investigators found no evidence of sabotage. Instead, they uncovered a series of maintenance failures at critical points. This part, the so-called back drive that holds everything together, was poorly maintained. Nuts here on the rear stretcher bar were missing. Nuts on the front stretcher bar had fallen off. That put immense strain on the lock stretcher bar. It fell out as the train crossed the points, and that caused the crash. Some of the inspectors' evidence of poor maintenance: the damaged thread on the front stretcher bar, and on the rear stretcher, compacted grease on one part and rust and a distorted thread on another.
Jarvis and Railtrack, or Network Rail as it now is, haven't admitted responsibility, and I think that gives rise to the fear that things haven't been done to put things right, because until people accept the blame, they're not going to accept that things have gone wrong.
Network Rail said in a statement,
"We are fundamentally altering the way rail maintenance is done. Under the new maintenance programme, Network Rail will have the capacity to direct rail maintenance activities, deciding what work has to be done and when it has to be done."
If the travelling public and our members were placed in danger by an act of negligence by the employers, it's their responsibility. If they get pats on the back and they get big share dividends when things are going well, then they have to expect to take the rap when things don't go too well either.
The results of the investigation by the Transport Police are expected to go to the Crown Prosecution Service in late summer. A spokesman said charges might include corporate manslaughter or individual manslaughter due to gross negligence.
Andrew Veach. Well, we asked Jarvis for an interview this evening, but the company was unwilling to appear. Joining us now from Westminster, the Transport Secretary, Alistair Darling. It's always good to have more detail in these reports, but the trouble is, for many people, nobody has actually been fingered as responsible. We still don't know who or what was at fault.
Well, we do know what caused the accident, as your report has just shown. In relation to who might have been responsible, that's the subject of the British Transport Police investigation, which, as you've just said, is continuing. What we do know now, though, is we have a very clear picture as to what was happening, and that is a history of poor maintenance. And the HSE is extremely critical of Railtrack, as you just said there, that they didn't understand the nature of the network. They clearly didn't understand the risks that therefore arose. They hadn't told their contractors what to do. So what you have there is an extremely unsatisfactory picture.
Do you want to see Jarvis now putting their hands up and saying, we accept that this was nothing to do with sabotage and vandalism and we'll stop going on about it?
The health and I'm not speaking for Jarvis, nor would you expect me to do so.
No, but would you like them to do that?
The HSE,
as the Secretary of State?
The HSE, this is the second report they have produced in which they have said there is no evidence to suggest that there was sabotage. There is, on the other hand, a great deal of evidence to suggest these points were not properly maintained. On the positive side, the HSE recognises that there has been a change in climate, a change in culture with the new not-for-profit company Network Rail operating in the public interest, which is putting safety at the very heart of what it does. A recognition that the Network Rail, the owner of the network, has to decide what maintenance is necessary, who does it, and check that it's actually carried out.
But isn't the trouble,
all that was missing in the past.
Isn't the trouble that our railway system is still fundamentally fragmented between different people who run different parts of it? And it's very difficult for you or anybody else to give any kind of guarantee that a disaster like Potters Bar couldn't happen again, because there's always somebody else you can blame.
No, I don't actually think that's what the Health and Safety Executive have found. What they have found was this set of points was not adequately maintained. As a result, they failed, and that caused the accident. The problem was that after privatisation, Railtrack farmed out all the decisions in relation to maintenance. They handed it over to a subcontractor. They didn't know the state of the network. They didn't know what work was being done or when. Now, Network Rail are finding instances of lack of proper control, lack of proper control over costs and so on all over the place now. What you are seeing, though, with Network Rail, as HSE recognises, is they are beginning to get a proper grip of the situation. What was wrong here?
How long before you can guarantee?
Was the lack of maintenance, and that is what caused the accident.
So how long before you can guarantee, as the Secretary of State, that all the points and all the tracks in Britain are being properly maintained, and that this sort of sequence of events should never happen again?
What I'm satisfied is that Network Rail is getting a grip of the situation. It's already brought 3 of these contracts back in-house. They've already made it clear they will decide what work is required, who is going to do it, and make sure it's checked at the end of it. Now, that is a giant step forward from where we were in Railtrack. The problems that the railway has faced is historically lack of investment, we're putting that right, but critically, lack of good management, particularly during the privatisation years.
Okay, after
that
the
is
police,
something that is now being put right.
After the Transport Police have finished their inquiries, are you prepared to sanction a public inquiry, which is what the campaigners, the survivors want?
Well, what I've said on many occasions now is that once I had the final HSE report, which I've now got the near final report, as you just reported, I'll have to decide whether or not a public inquiry is appropriate. I will have to take account of the fact that there is a police inquiry continuing. There's 2 things I want to avoid. One is having yet another very long delay, which an inquiry would inevitably occasion. The second thing is I would not want to prejudice any proceedings that may take place. So those are the things that I want to weigh in the balance, but I haven't taken a decision yet as to whether or not there ought to be an inquiry, but I do need to take account of the fact the police inquiry is still continuing.
Alistair Darling, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, the Conservative MP for Potters Bar, James Clapperson, is in Leeds. Well, you heard the Secretary of State's response about a public inquiry. What do you make of that?
Well, I do think a public inquiry is now more urgent than ever. I think the case has actually become stronger now we've had the publication of this report. Anybody who reads this report and uses the railways will find their hair standing on end, frankly, when they read some of the findings of the report about the way in which this particular set of points was maintained.
But what would a public inquiry achieve that the Health and Safety Executive and the police aren't able to achieve?
Well, I think, first of all, we haven't got the full picture as far as the circumstances which led to the points failure is concerned. We know technically what happened, but we don't know all the facts about those circumstances. We need to get the full picture. We also need to apply the lessons from this throughout the rail network to make sure that nothing like this can happen again. And we really need the force of a public inquiry to do that.
He says Network Rail has got the matter in hand and is improving things drastically. Do you accept that?
Well, I mean, this is what is often said in these circumstances, you know, that was then, this is now. I mean, frankly, the report is so damning in its the shortcomings which it found about the way in which the points were adjusted and maintained, about the inspection system. So about the way in which the points had been set up, adjusted and maintained, the deficiencies in the inspection system, and what happened when a problem was reported with the points the night before the accident took place.
Yeah, but I mean, what about
they
now?
Really are absolutely damning.
Are you going to be in the bizarre position of arguing for renationalisation?
Yeah. What I'm arguing for is finding out what happened and making the railways safe. And what I'm saying is that the problems which were disclosed by this report, the shortcomings were so fundamental that we need something like a public inquiry, the force of a public inquiry to try and put things right.
James Clapson, thank you very much. Now here's Bridget Nzeku with more of today's news.
There was good news today for Abbas Amini, the Iranian asylum seeker who stitched his eyes, ears and mouth closed in protest at the threat of deportation. He has been granted indefinite leave to stay in the UK. But that wasn't enough for him to give up his protest. He's vowing to continue his hunger strike until the government reviews its entire asylum policy.
In his room in a house in Nottingham, Abbas Amini spent the afternoon resting. His eyes, ears and mouth still bear the stitches he put there himself. The Immigration Appeals Tribunal has now told the Home Office it cannot appeal the decision to grant him asylum. With the rejection of the Home Office appeal against Abbas Amini, his refugee status is confirmed and he may now stay in this country. But Mr. Amini has decided to continue with his desperate protest until the government improves its treatment of asylum seekers.
One, respect and dignity for asylum seekers in the way they are treated in this country. Two, for countries such as Iran to not to be recognized as safe countries, but quite the opposite, as a very unsafe countries, Iran, Afghanistan and many other countries, and stop the deportations to those countries.
This afternoon, another visit from the doctor. He says Abbas Amini is a resilient character and he spoke to him early this morning.
Abbas was clearly mentally competent and had the capacity to understand my ethical obligations and the risk of irreparable damage to his eyes and kidneys, and the fact that without fluids he would eventually slip into a coma.
If that happens, he'll be taken to hospital and supported via a drip. Abbas has said that if he regains consciousness in such circumstances, he himself will remove the tubes being used to keep him alive.
The number of cases where objects have been thrown into oncoming traffic from motorway bridges has dramatically increased in the last few months, police said today. The news comes along with the release of CCTV footage showing two 9-year-old girls on a bridge in Surrey earlier this month throwing a brick through the window of a car. The pair were quickly caught but are too young to be prosecuted. Surrey police say they've dealt with an average of 26 such incidents each month since the beginning of this year, twice as many as in any of the last 3 years. While we've been on air, the Palestinian Prime Minister Mahmoud Abbas has met with his Israeli counterpart Ariel Sharon in Jerusalem, ahead of what's hoped will be a groundbreaking three-way summit with US President George Bush next week. But their meeting comes a day after a day of inflamed hostility as Israeli settlers established a new settlement outpost in the West Bank. 8 suicides and more than 1,000 cases of adverse effects that may be linked to the antidepressant drug Seroxat have been reported to the Department of Health. It was prescribed to 400,000 people in Britain last year, and the manufacturer GlaxoSmithKline insists it is safe. But many users have complained of side effects and severe withdrawal symptoms when trying to come off it. The Department of Health warned today that the reporting scheme that highlighted possible problems with Seroxat may only be picking up 10 to 15% of potential serious reactions. Toronto may raise the number of probable SARS cases from 12 to around 70. The figure may rocket because of changes in how the government classifies victims of the virus. If the World Health Organization definitions are followed, that would likely put the number of sufferers in the city at over 5 times previous estimates. It's 50 years today since Sir Edmund Hillary and his Sherpa guide Tenzing Norgay became the first men to scale Mount Everest. The New Zealander's been in Nepal's capital, Kathmandu, attending a week-long celebration to mark the conquest of the 29,000-foot peak. Hillary, delighted by the warm welcome he's received, has been presented with an honorary citizenship of Nepal. Back in London, one Sherpa, a 5-time veteran of the mountain, was disappointed to be missing out on all the festivities. He spoke to us earlier about the legacy of that momentous climb.
Hillary is absolutely brilliant. Without Hillary, we have no hospital, no bridges, no schools. I mean, there's a school, but we have to walk quite a long way from where we live. So yes, Hillary is our God, our man in our culture, our area. So when we heard Hillary is coming, so we spent a week to clear all the road and everything's sweeping, and we don't have a hoover, so we have to sweep everything by hand, and we appropriate a flower for him and a white scarf and get ready, and yeah, he's a great man.
Bob Hope celebrates his 100th birthday today, and in honour of the occasion, 35 American states have proclaimed it Bob Hope Day. The legendary entertainer was born in London but emigrated to America with his family 96 years ago. He spent 75 years working in radio, theatre, television and film. Bob Hope appeared in more than 50 films. His double act with Bing Crosby in the Road 2 movies was especially successful. He won several honorary Oscars for his work and was also awarded an honorary knighthood.
When we come back, Britain is expected to join a UN peacekeeping mission to the Democratic Republic of Congo, where tribal militias continue to kill, rape and rob civilians. But is it enough to stop the bloodshed in a war that's left millions dead?
I was headhunted again last week.
Well, I've definitely been earmarked for the board. In fact, I've quadrupled my turnover inside 5 years.
Can I give anyone a lift?
So, what did you say you did?
I didn't.
This is the ultimate collection from the Small Faces. 50 classic songs from the band that shaped a generation. Their greatest hits together at last in one definitive double CD set. It's Small Faces Ultimate Collection. Get it now.
Welcome back. This is Channel 4 News. Now, the civil war in the Democratic Republic of Congo that is believed to have claimed the lives of as many as 3 million people in the past 5 years is again attracting the attention of the international community. Britain is likely to announce tomorrow a small contingent of troops to back up French peacekeepers. A Security Council resolution introduced by France seeking authorization to deploy an international force to the war-torn African Republic is expected to be passed at the UN tomorrow. With our diplomatic correspondent Lindsay Hilson is with me. What kind of force is required?
Well, the kind of force that's needed is the kind of force which can stop the sort of horror that we've seen going on. There are very few clinics and hospitals in the area around Bunia, but the ones there see the most horrific kind of injuries. Children who've got burns because people from rival militias are burning down people's houses. Children who've had limbs mutilated, fingers chopped off. And one of the most horrific things about this conflict is that it's children themselves on the streets with the guns. The militias have employed people as young as 10 years old. Now, the guns they're carrying come from Uganda and Rwanda, neighbouring countries. Those two countries have now agreed that this peacekeeping force should be deployed. So at last there is some hope of trying to stabilise the situation.
And so what role for the British troops?
Well, The British troops are going to be there in tens rather than in hundreds, I'm told. And it's not going to be a large deployment like in Sierra Leone. They may be engineers doing things like expanding the runway at Bunya so humanitarian aid and other soldiers can come in. They'll be backing up the French in the headquarters. The French will take the lead. There'll also be South Africans and other African troops. But this isn't going to be a long-term deployment. It'll be the UN, and then the European Union is likely to take control of the force. But it's only going to be, as the French are telling us, until September the 1st.
The mandate should be to stabilize the situation, the security and humanitarian situation in Bunia, to protect the airport and the refugee camps in Bunia, and, if necessary, the population in this town.
How much of an emergency is this? We carried a report at the weekend saying something like 300 people have been killed in the matter of a couple of days. Is this a real ongoing crisis?
Oh, this is desperate. There's been appalling violence in the Bunya area since 1999, and these sporadic massacres. There are no massacres happening at the moment today, as far as I know, but at the moment there's nothing to prevent that kind of thing happening again. There are these Uruguayan peacekeepers there, but they seem powerless to be able to do anything. The only hope is that this force, a proper robust force, can go in. Now, it can't in the long term stop the causes of this conflict, but at least if it can put a lid on it and get some more diplomatic attention paid to it, maybe it can provide some stability.
Do you think France will pay any price for its position over Iraq when it comes to the UN? Is there going to be any punishment going on?
No, I don't think so. I don't think that that's going to be involved in here. The problem which France has is that Rwanda, one of the countries involved, sees France as the enemy. But what we've got here is tens of thousands of refugees who desperately need humanitarian aid, and massacres that can start again at any time. I think at the moment, both in the UN and in the European Union, it's understood that somebody has to try and do something. But this is only a small part of the Congo. There is still a peace process supposedly going on in the rest of the country that isn't really working. And unless more diplomatic attention is paid and more countries are willing to put their own troops at risk, we may see more violence occurring in the rest of the country as well. This is a situation which is absolutely desperate.
Lindsay Hilson, thank you. You're watching Channel 4 News. Our main headlines tonight. Abbas Amini is continuing his hunger strike despite winning his asylum case. He's vowed to carry on for the sake of other refugees, even though he's been without food and water now for 7 days. Poor maintenance was to blame for the Potters Bar rail crash. Today, a health and safety executive report rejected claims by the maintenance company Jarvis that sabotage may have caused the fatal derailment. And Tony Blair has denied accusations that Number 10 exaggerated a dossier of information about Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. Speaking to British troops in Basra, he said that the war against Iraq will have an important place in history.
When people look back on this time and look back on this conflict, I honestly believe they will see this as one of the defining moments of our century. And you did it.
As a peace activist working in the Gaza Strip, Thomas Hurndall accepted that there were risks. But last month, without explanation, he was shot by Israeli forces. Now in a coma, his parents today brought him back home to Britain. They say the Israeli army still owe them answers. In a moment, I'll be talking to Thomas's father, Anthony Hurndall, and an Israeli government spokesman. But first, Lindsay Taylor has this.
The parents of Tom Hurndall hold a news conference this afternoon, just after flying back from Israel with their severely injured son. He's not regained consciousness since being shot in the head more than 6 weeks ago.
Tremendously relieved to have Tom home. It's really been a very gruelling 6.5 weeks. I can't tell you anymore. I just am delighted to have Tom home now.
The scene just after he was shot and injured on the 11th of April at the Rafah refugee camp. Tom Hurndall was shot in the head by an Israeli soldier, hit by a bullet fired from an Israeli watchtower.
I'm calling you from Rafah. A British citizen called Tom Hurndall has just been shot in the head by the Israelis. We would like you to inform the Israeli army to stop shooting in the Yivna area.
The 21-year-old was rushed to hospital, but his injuries were so severe that he's remained in a coma ever since.
There is the damage in the brain, and there is the fracture in the skull, multiple fracture in the skull, in the exit.
Since then, his family have been struggling to gain answers, meeting the young Palestinian child whom eyewitnesses say Tom Hurndall had bent down to carry to safety when he was shot. His family point out that he was wearing the same distinctive bright orange jacket as here when filmed 4 days earlier in front of Israeli army bulldozers with members of the protest group, the International Solidarity Movement.
Tom was a photojournalist in the making. He started a course of photojournalism. He'd gone on to observe and to photograph what was happening in Gaza and the ISM, the movement. He joined as effectively as an observer. He took part with in their activities with them. But he went out as an observer. I think that to understand it, you need to know the truth. And I'm afraid to say very few people in Israel, particularly, and in the outside world, seem to know what is happening in the occupied territories. Tom was the third person to be shot in the same place in 48 hours. The third civilian.
The Israeli army said the incident is under investigation, but Tom Hurndall's parents say they've had little or no cooperation in finding out why their son was shot, leaving him in a coma, from which they've been told it's unlikely he'll ever recover.
Well, with me now is Tom Hurndall's father, Anthony, but first we'll speak to the Israeli Foreign Ministry spokesman, Daniel Tope, who's in Jerusalem. I assume the investigators have spoken to the soldier who shot Mr. Hurndall in the head. Have they ascertained whether he intended to shoot him, or what was he aiming at?
I can't share details of the actual investigation with you, but it's been a thorough IDF investigation into this completely tragic incident, and every Israeli feels for the nightmare that the Hurndalls must be going through. The results of that investigation have been shared with the British Embassy and through them with the Hurndall family. And like the Hurndall family, Israel has been just as keen to find out exactly what happened in this case.
Family don't feel that you've been as forthcoming as you could have been. They haven't been told, for example, whether you have spoken to this man or not and what he said.
I understand, I wasn't present at the briefing that was given to them, but I understand that it was as a full investigation as the IDF is entitled to make. Obviously, it's a tragic incident. We have to remember, though, that this is a closed military zone. There is a British travel advisory warning people not to go into this region. And while many of the youngsters that come to this region calling themselves peace activists are tremendously well-intentioned, tragically, the International Solidarity Movement is not a peace movement. It's a political organization that subscribes to a very, very problematic notion of resistance, that supports terrorism, has hidden terrorists, and really is taking youngsters and placing them in an untenable situation.
Well, that suggests you regard the International Solidarity Movement as a legitimate target. Thomas Hurndall was a member of that movement. He was a peace activist.
They're absolutely not a legitimate target. But in a situation like this, where you have a closed zone where terrorists, we didn't choose to define this as a combat zone. It was defined as a combat zone by the terrorists who set up their headquarters there, chose to operate, hiding behind children, hiding behind international volunteers. In a situation like that, you clearly have to take every possible measure to stop any injury to the civilians. But at the same time, that doesn't mean you have to give carte blanche to the terrorists. If you say that the moment terrorists hide behind civilians, then you won't take any measures against them at all, then basically you're inviting every terrorist to set up shop in a school or a kindergarten. It's simply...
Well, stay there, if you will, for a moment. I'd like to come back to you in a couple of minutes. But with me now, Anthony Hurndall, what do you make of that assertion about the movement that Thomas is a member of?
Well, I think I'd like to take up two points, if I might, on that. One is this idea that there's a full inquiry. There has not been a full inquiry. The IDF have simply carried out a field inquiry, as they describe it, amongst their own soldiers. They have declined consistently.
What have they told you?
They have told us nothing until they produce this report. There's been no discussion. We've been presented with this report indirectly through the embassy. It is clearly incorrect. It cites the wrong location. It does admit that, effectively, it admits that Tom was shot by them, but it does not describe the same event. It describes a different event, which in my view is a complete fabrication. I was at a meeting with Mr. Taub the other day when their representative stated there's one thing of which we are sure, and that is that there was only one shot. Now, I have interviewed 15 people, all of whom describe a series of shots in and amongst children, and the final shot was the one which hit Tom in the head.
Do you believe he was deliberately targeted?
I believe that he was deliberately shot as a civilian. I do not know, absolutely, whether he was shot because he was an activist and whether the person who shot him knew he was an activist. He was wearing an orange jacket, which signified he was an activist. Mr. Tower was present at a meeting where I asked to be allowed to go into the tower, from which I could then see for myself what you could see from that tower. I am waiting for a positive yes to that question. I've said I would go on any terms, I would sign any waivers, I would comply with any security requirements to enable me to see what they saw. What
do you make of the Israeli attitude towards the international solidarity movement? He's made a number of assertions there about its relationship with Palestinian terrorism.
I have made it clear that Tom was more of an observer than an active member. He wasn't an activist, but he joined them with a view to seeing what they were doing and what was happening in the occupied territories. As to his assertions, as to the ISM itself, they are a well-intentioned body of volunteers, the internationals. They are backed by Palestinian money and they are funded by Palestinians. But those who go there to make a statement that they wish to oppose in a non-violent manner violations of human rights.
But they put themselves in the way of harm, don't they?
They do not put themselves in the way of harm. They put themselves in an area which, taking Tom, the area where Tom was shot, is a residential area. It is close to the border. It is a residential area which is slowly being depopulated by the actions of the Israeli army.
Mr. Hurndall, thank you very much indeed. If I can return to Jerusalem now, Mr. Tobe, are you prepared to let the Hurndalls go to this observation post from which the shot was made?
Well, at the meeting that Mr. Hurndall talked about, we said that we would do everything possible to help them. We, together with them, share their concern that the truth has to come out. We invited them to share any information that they have, any of these testimonies that Mr. Hurndall says that he has. One of the problems that the army has with his account is that at the point where they say Mr. Hurndall was shot, there's simply no line of fire, no visibility from the tower. So to them it sounds problematic, but they would be very keen to have any information from them.
If you do get to the truth of exactly what happened, is there any possibility of disciplinary action?
Certainly, Israel, we don't always have the right answers in this impossible situation, but we are asking the right questions. And when there is an event that we can learn lessons from, then obviously we have a tremendous interest to do that. But we have to remember that unlike the international solidarity movement, which unfortunately only cares about protecting the Palestinians, including the terrorists, and doesn't unfortunately care about well, since Abu Mazen was elected, there have been 53 separate suicide bomb attacks against Israelis, five of which have been successful. Unfortunately, at the moment, the only thing that stands between those suicide bombers and our families, our children, are these soldiers who are working in impossible conditions. Anything that we can do to improve that situation, anything that we can do to stop tragedies like this, obviously we will do, but we're in a complicated situation where, tragically, we can't do it alone.
Daniel Tobe, thank you very much indeed.
Not at all.
Over to Bridget again now for the rest of the day's news.
The woman accused of murdering her 3 babies may have passed on a genetic disorder that could run in her family, Reading Crown Court heard today. No medical cause was established for the deaths of Tripti Patel's 3 babies between 1997 and 2001. A police investigation began after the 3rd baby was found to have 4 fractured ribs.
Tripti Patel left court tonight having heard that her 3 babies very likely inherited a genetic disorder that caused their deaths. Professor Michael Patton, a consultant in clinical genetics, said he couldn't suggest a specific gene defect, but that was simply because doctors still have a lot to learn about genetics. Yesterday, Tripti Patel's grandmother told the court 5 of her 12 children died in India in infancy. Professor Patton was in court for her evidence. He said today he discounted 2 of the 5 deaths. One was a premature baby, the other he put down to gastroenteritis, but that left 3 significant deaths. There may be a genetic problem, he said. These were all deaths at a very early stage in the first weeks or months of life. He added that even if the jury chose to discount the 3 deaths in India, it was still perfectly likely that Mr. and Mrs. Patel had passed a recessive genetic disorder on to 3 of their 4 children. The prosecution says Mrs. Patel smothered or squeezed her babies to death. Ammar, Jamie and Mia collapsed and died over a 4-year period. The first 2 were blamed on cot death. Mia's post-mortem in 2001 found 4 fractured ribs. Mrs. Patel kept her head in her hands as a slide showing a cross-section of her daughter's rib was passed around the court. Professor Fremont, an expert in bones and joints, described the fractures as little buckles, which he believed were caused by the resuscitation attempts on the child. He also found that Mia had weaker ribs than babies of a similar age. Tripti Patel denies 3 counts of murder, and the case continues.
David Beckham is to make a televised appeal to football fans, warning them to behave themselves when they attend international matches. The England captain will appear on national television before next Tuesday's match against Serbia and Montenegro in Leicester. Convicted rapist and former world champion boxer Mike Tyson has told an American TV network that he never raped the woman who accused him in 1991. But he said he hates her so much he now wants to rape her. The interview is to be broadcast in America tonight. In 1992, Tyson was sentenced to 6 years in prison and served 3 years before being released on parole. He later regained his boxing licence. The English cricket selectors have unveiled a new-look team for their upcoming one-day matches against Pakistan, Zimbabwe and South Africa. The new squad relies heavily on youth and includes 6 uncapped players. But experience will come in the form of strike bowler and surprise inclusion Darren Gough. The 32-year-old has not been an England regular for around 18 months after a string of knee operations. The markets now, and at the close, the index of 100 leading shares was up by almost 12 points. A short time ago, the pound was up against the dollar by more than a cent, and sterling was down against the euro by just over 1/10 of a cent. And a look at the weather. The satellite shows cloud across Ireland, parts of Scotland and northwestern England, with patchier, higher level cloud in the south and east. It'll be a dry night overnight, mostly cloudy but some clear spells, and quite warm, temperatures between 8 Celsius in Scotland and 13 Celsius in the south. After a dry and sunny start tomorrow, heavy showers and possibly thunder and hail are likely to affect inland parts of Britain. The chart shows highest temperatures tomorrow between 11 Celsius in Shetland and 26 Celsius in London. Nominations for the Turner Prize were announced today. All of the names on this year's shortlist are well-established artists, and their average age is 40. That's older than nominees usually are. There are 5 names on the list: the Chapman brothers, Jake and Dinos, Anya Galaccio, Willie Doherty and Grayson Perry. The likely favourites are the Chapman brothers. Their recent work includes a tribal sculpture clutching a McDonald's takeaway.